Shalom Alechem. Today is Yom Hamishi b'Shabbat, Thursday, or actually here in Eretz Yisrael it's about to become Leil Yom Shishi, the beginning of Friday, Or Yod Beth Shevat Tov Shin Pei Well, according to our calendar, corresponding to the 29th of January 2026, according to the Gregorian calendar. You should be able to see in front of you the end of Hilchot Kriyat Shema in the Rambam. Rambam says as follows. We looked at this last time. We wish to look at it briefly once more and compare it to what Rambam writes in Hilchot Tefillah. This is Hilchot Kriyat Shema, and therefore the purview of these halachot generally is Kriyat Shema and that which is essentially the same as Kriyat Shema, similar in nature to Kriyat Shema, namely Talmud Torah, the study of Torah. Rambam says here, Kol HaTameim, all those who are tameh, ritually impure, according to the Torah. So this could be a person who's tameh meth, a person who came into contact with the dead. This could be a person who came into contact with a nevela. A nevela is a dead animal, or it could be other forms of tumah as well. Any such person, kol hatameim hayavim b'kriyat shema, they are required to recite Kriyat Shema, umevarachim lefanea ulahara, and they recite not only Kriyat Shema but also the barachot associated with it before and after, wahen b'tumatham, even though they are tameh. And even though we may be speaking about a form of tum'ah which could be quickly rectified, so to speak, אף על פי שאפשר להן לעלות מטומאתן בו ביום. Even though this person who is tameh could in fact become tahor, he could become ritually pure that very day. כגון הנובעים בשרץ, a person who touched a dead sheretz, one of the shmona sheretzim mentioned in the Torah, various types of lizards and things of this nature. Or benida, or a person who came into contact with a menstruant woman, or things touched by that woman, wuzava, or mishkavan, v'chayotze bahen. Any of these things, a person can become tahor on that day by going to the Mikveh. There's no need for a drawn-out process in order to become tahor, as opposed to what? As opposed to tumath meth, which takes at least 7 days to become tahor from. Wa'ezra ubeth dino, however, the waw of wa'ezra is like the word however. However, the fact is that Ezra HaSofer, we're talking about nearly 2,500 years ago, ubeth dino, and other chachamim who were with him at that time, tiknu shelo yikra ba'al keri levado mishar hatameim ad sheyitbo. They decreed that a person who is a Ba'al Keri, in other words, this could be either a man who had sexual relations, shall we say, let's assume with his wife, obviously, and the same is true for his wife also, for the male and for the female. Such a person, in order to study Torah and therefore recite Kriyat Shema, has to be tovel, has to go to the Mikveh, to immerse themselves in a mikveh, and then they become tahor. Welo, however, Rambam says, lo pashata takana zo b'chol Yisrael. We find this halacha in the Mishneh, in the Talmud, discussed at great length. The initial mention of this takana is in Perek Meruben, Masechet Bava Kama, where it mentions 10 takanoth, of Ezra Sofer, and this is one of them. And there it speaks about studying Torah, not studying Torah when a person is a Baal Keri. But this takana eventually fell into disuse, or simply not lived up to by most of the Sibur, by most of Am Yisrael. ולא היה כוח לרוב הציבור לעמוד בה. Most of Am Yisrael did not have literally the koach, the strength, they did not have the perseverance to live up to this takana, which had been in place for several centuries. לפיכך בטלה, and therefore this gezerah ceased to be batala. And therefore Rambam sums up and says, Uchvar nahavu, and therefore you should know it is the practice, universal practice, nahavu kol Yisrael, of all Jews, likroth b'Torah, or likroth Kriyat Shema, to study Torah and to recite Kriyat Shema, Wehen ba'alei karain, even though they are in the state of being a Baal Keri, lefi she'en divrei Torah mekabalim tumah. This is the well-known statement of Rabbi Yehuda ben Bethera in the Talmud, Masechet Barachot, for example. She'en divrei Torah mekabalim tumah. Tumah, by definition, can only apply, really, to a material object. That includes a human being, or a vessel, or something material, something of a physical nature. Spiritual things, non-corporeal, non-material realities cannot become tameh. And therefore, Rabbi Yehuda ben Bethera, exactly his reasoning, whether he was simply disagreeing with the original gezerah of Ezra Sofer, which is difficult to assume. That's a very unlikely discussion or position to take. This is discussed by the Tosafot in Bava Kama. It's more probably because he and other Chachamim felt that Yasa Sechareno Behefsedeno, that it was more often than not the case that many Jews were, as a result of this gezerah, not reciting Shema or not studying Torah. They were refraining from doing these things. It also applies to Berachot and Tefillah, as we shall see. And they obviously saw that which Rambam writes here, that more and more people were not conforming to this decree. They were not going to the Mikveh immediately as required. And therefore, this resulted in a kind of bitul Torah, a massive societal bitul Torah, shall we say. And this is too great a price to pay. That I think is the more likely explanation. Why Rabbi Yehuda ben Bethera felt it was necessary to announce this new position. So Rambam says, "Uchval nahu kol Yisrael likroth b'Torah or likroth Kriyat Shema, wehen ba'alei karain," even though they are in the state of being a Baal Keri, and there was such a gezerah, but this gezerah was essentially nullified. Lefi she'en divrei Torah mekabalim tumah. Divrei Torah are the very essence of kedusha in this world, and spiritual things, as we said, are not affected by tumah. And it is better that Am Yisrael study Torah and recite Kriyat Shema, etc., without hindrance, rather than maintain this gezerah, which apparently was becoming increasingly ignored. And there is a general rule with regards to gezerot of Chachamim, that if once a gezerah is in place, even though it was originally accepted, and most of the Tzibur were able to live up to it, if it becomes apparent in the fullness of time that a majority, the Rov of Am Yisrael, is not in that, no longer able to live up to this gezerah, she'en Rov HaTzibur yochalim la'amod ba, then the gezerah is betela me'elea. In other words, the halachic status, the legal status of a gezerah, is also a function of how it was received by Am Yisrael. If a gezerah was never received, it was never accepted, it was never acted upon by a majority of the people, of course, the people that we're referring to are Torah people, then the gezerah never gain traction, and therefore does not take effect. So we see that the concept of a gezerah involves a few stages. First of all, the Chachamim have to become aware of a certain situation, which requires their attention. And then they have to discuss and reach the conclusion that something needs to be done, something that has not been done previously. And then they have to announce this to the Tzibur, to the public, and the public have to accept it, and they have to begin to live up to this new standard, or this refrain from doing a certain thing, or accept upon themselves a certain thing. In this case, is to accept upon themselves the chovah to go to the Mikveh. And this is in a very fundamental way an expression of the workings of Torah She'Ba'al Peh within Am Yisrael, within the Jewish people. That it is the interaction of the Chachamim and the people, and Am Yisrael. There is no Torah without Am Yisrael. Am Yisrael is an integral and essential part of the picture. That is that. And Rambam says this is the halacha. You will note that Rambam does not mention Tefillah here. Neither, by the way, does the original Takana mentioned in Masechet Bava Kama. Neither does that statement over there in Bava Kama mention anything about Tefillah. It speaks about La'asok B'Torah. In other words, the Ba'alei Keri should not study Torah until they go to the Mikveh. We do, however, see in the Mishnah that this gezerah also applies to Tefillah. Now, if we, from here, we turn to Hilchot Tefillah, Perek Dalet, Halacha Dalet. You should be able to see it in front of you. Rambam says as follows: Kol ha'tomeim rohasim yedehem bilevad k'tehorim u'mitpalalim. K'tehorim u'mitpalalim. In other words, Rambam makes this statement here in Perek Revi'i, which is the Perek in which Rambam discusses the various actions and injunctions that a person has to take note of before he can approach Hashem in Tefillah, right, and stand up and recite Shemona Esrei. So Rambam discusses 5 things at the beginning of the Perek. Hamishad Davarim Me'akavim et HaTefillah Af al pi shehigia zmana. In other words, even though it is now time for Tefillah, there are certain things you have to first take care of. And the first of these is Taharat HaYadayim, which means Natilat Yadayim. And on the heel of that discussion, which Rambam discusses, which we'll see later when we get to Perek Revi'i from the beginning of these halachot, immediately Rambam goes on to say, by the way, you should know, Kol HaTameim, what I just discussed, what I just said to you, has to do with Netilat Yadayim, only with the hands, that is required for reciting Shmoneh Esrei, any Shmoneh Esrei. Shaharit, Minha, Arvit, Shabbat, Yom Tov, Yom Chol, but it makes no difference. Rahasim Yadehem Bilevav, in other words, they are required to do Netilat Yadayim, Kat Tahorim, even though a person is Tameh, he acts as if he's Tahor. The halacha is that he may say Tefillah. There is no Mi'ikar Hadin, there was no reason to assume that a person who is Tameh, again, any form of Tum'ah, prevents him from reciting Tefillah. Even though, again, he could become Tameh he could become Tahor simply by going to the Mikveh. Afal pi she'efshar lahen litbol ולעלות מטומאתה, and even though this is doable, אין הטבילה מעכבת. Such tevilah is not ma'akev. It's desirable, but it's not ma'akev. A person can recite tefillah without this. Here we're not talking about divrei Torah, we're talking about tefillah. This is what these halachot, hilchot tefillah, are about. And then Rambam immediately goes on to say, why am I mentioning this to you? Because uchvar be'anu, and in the previous halachot, that is to say in Hilchot Kriyat Shema, Perek Dalet, וכבר ביארנו שעזרא תיקן שלא יקרא בעל קרי בלבד דברי תורה עד שיטבול. In other words, we have already mentioned the fact that there was a gezerah already in the time of Ezra HaSofer, which removed a Baal Keri from the category of Tameim in general and gave them a special status. All Tameim are were allowed to study Torah and also allowed to recite Tefillah. וכבר ביארנו שעזרא תיקן שלא יקרא בעל קרי בלבד דברי תורה עד שיטבול. We mentioned this fact, and we also mentioned, as we saw in Hilchot Kriyat Shema, that eventually this gezerah unraveled. Now Rambam here adds something interesting. ובית דין שעמדו אחרי כן הפקינו אף לתפילה. They extended this gezerah also to tefillah, to Shmoneh Esrei. שלא יתפלל בעל קרי בלבד עד שיטבול. This is not mentioned in Bava Kama, it's mentioned in Masechet Barachot, it's in the Mishneh, and Rambam goes on to explain, ולא מפני טומאה וטהרה נודעו בה. The rationale behind this gezerah was not because of Tumah and Tahara. There is such a concept, Tumah and Tahara, very, very definitely. There is such a concept in the Torah, but that is not what underpins this gezerah. אלא, כדי שלא יהיו תלמידי חכמים נשואים אצל נשותיהם כתרנגולים. According to some nuschaot, instead of tarnugolim, you read it tarnugolim. Either way, the gezerah was made, and it's interesting to note, Rambam says, it was made with Talmidei Chachamim in mind, which is not all of Am Yisrael. Not all of them. It's not the general public. Let's assume in a positive state, that is to say, in a more one of the better periods in Am Yisrael's history, you might assume that we're talking about 30% of the public, but not 100, not by any means 100% of the public. And this is perhaps also why the takana unraveled, because you cannot make a takana only for Talmidei Chachamim. There is no such thing as making a takana, which applies only to Talmidei Chachamim. If you make a takana, you make a gezerah, it applies to all Jews. But in truth, it was aimed at Talmidei Chachamim, or at least, which means, and the word Talmidei Chachamim in most contexts refers to what we call today Bnei Torah, or Bahorei Shiva, or people who take the Torah very seriously, and who are makpid al Chala Kahamura, people who were makpid about, shall we say, Turumot Ma'asrot, as opposed to Amei Haaretz, who were a majority of the populace, who were less makpid, who were less pedantic about such things. Really, among Talmidei Chachamim, that is to say, the Chachamim and their Talmidim and those who followed them and those who cared greatly about what they had to say, it was not only such things as Terumot Ma'asrot, it was also things to do with Tumah B'Tahara. And you may also connect, therefore, this Gezerah to that fact that what was called Haver, which was another term for a Talmid Chachamim, or one of the Tnaim to be considered Haver, who has joined the ranks of the Haverim, is literally a colleague, shall we say, is someone who was makpid, who was careful about Inyanei Tumah B'Tahara, which requires quite a lot of care. And it is something above and beyond the call of duty. It's not required min Torah that a person throughout the year constantly be in a state of tahara. There is no such halacha. When a Jew comes to Yerushalayim barechel on one of the shalosh regalim, then he has to be tahor, because you cannot partake from any of the korbanot, for example, or you cannot eat ma'aser sheni, for example, if you're not tahor. A kohen who eats teruma may only do so when he's tahor. So kohanim were much more regularly in a state of tahara than many other people. Talmidei Chachamim, in many ways, emulated the kohanim, the way of life of the kohanim. But this was not nahalat hakalah. It was not something that all accepted upon themselves. It wasn't really expected everybody would. So this gezerah was aimed at Talmidei Chachamim. Rambam says here explicitly, "Kadesh shiu Talmidei Chachamim mithuyim es shelo yiu mithuyim es nashotehem ketanu cholim." In other words, it was actually a way of encouraging Talmidei Chachamim not to be in sexual contact with their wives constantly, which is considered part of the, as it were, the regimen and the training, the spiritual, ideological training and training of midot and self-control and what have you, that Talmidei Chachamim should develop. So that was the purpose. And that is why this takana only applied to a Ba'al Keri, not to a person who touched a sheretz or who participated in a funeral or something like that. And Rambam here goes further into this matter, and he says in Halacha He, Lefichach, Hayu Omerim, Bizman takana zo. So when this takana was in force, the halacha was, as we find in the Mishneh, the end of the third perek of Berachot, she'afilu zav shera'a keri, even if a person was already tameh because he was a zav, which is a person who's suffering from a certain condition where semen or seminal fluid is expelled from his body without him wishing that to be the case. So even if a person was already in a state of zivuth, he was already a zav, but now, ura'a keri, in other words, now he had relations, shall we say, with his wife. He's still required to do this tevilah, even though it's not going to make him tahor. because the Zav has to wait a certain amount of time, and then he has to be tovel in Maim Hayim, in the Ma'ayan, etc. So a regular Tefillah and a regular Mikveh is not sufficient to make him tahor, and nevertheless, the Mishnah stated that a Zav Shara'a Keri, and similarly a Nida, a woman who is a Nida, menstruant, Shepalata Shichvat Zera, and she had relations, and it is normal after such relations for some semen or seminal fluid to be expelled from her body. She is also required to go to the mikveh. And the same is true for a woman who had relations and then she became nida. In all of these cases, the point is that the tevilah will not make them tahor, and yet they are required to be tovel, to go to the mikveh in order to study Torah, in order to recite barachot, in order to be able to daven, to pray. All such people, tzrichin tevilah likriyat Shema v'chen letfilah mipnei akeri. That was the takana. Afal pi shehem tameim, even though they are and will remain tameh. V'chen hadin nofen, says Rambam, and this follows logically. She'en tevilah zo mipnei tahara. The purpose of this tevilah is not to be tahor, ela mipnei hagezerah. As we explained, this gezerah, for those reasons that we mentioned. Shelo yu mithuim es enoshotehem tamid. So it was definitely part of the a standard of behavior, of lifestyle, if you like, that was expected of and encouraged among Talmidei Chachamim. You could even suggest that originally, when the takana was made in the time of Ezra or in subsequent generations, for quite some time, perhaps for centuries, the percentage of Am Yisrael who fit that description of Talmidei Chachamim was relatively limited. Perhaps, let's say, it was 5-10%, maybe 15%. And over time, precisely because of the success of the Chachamim and their Talmidim to spread their ideas, their notions, their way of life, their standards amongst more and more people, the percentage of people who adopted the lifestyle or many of these standards of the Chachamim and their Talmidim increased. It was no longer 5 or 10 or maybe 15%, it was now 20 or 30%. Which is the impression that we receive, at least that I receive, from some later generations. In other words, generations, shall we say, towards the mid-period or later period of Beit Sheni, or even the period immediately after the Churban. So sometimes what I'm suggesting is that sometimes the success of the system can also have certain can result in certain collateral damage, because then there you have more and more people who are in the system, who've adopted your system or wish to be part of your club, as it were, because the Chachamim and the Talmidim were a discernible class within the Jewish people, within Am Yisrael, just as the Nevi'im and Bnei Nevi'im were in earlier generations. So the successors of that world of the Nevi'im were the Chachamim and their Talmidim. And when you adopt, and more people are accepted within your system, perhaps some of them are not really up to it. They wish to be, perhaps, and maybe they can live up to 50% of the regimen, but not all of it. And I think that's very possibly what happened here. And as we said, this gezerah was batel. That's what Rambam says here also. Uchvar batala gam takana zo shel tefillah. Lefi shelo pasheta bechol Yisrael, u'lo haya koach b'tzibur la'amod ba. And therefore, this takana, to do with Torah and Tefillah, and here we discuss the main emphasis here is on Tefillah, in Hilchot Tefillah. This takana eventually fell into disuse, according to which it is now, as we read earlier in Hilchot Kriyat Shema and Perek Revi'i, it is therefore, once the takana is no longer in force, it is possible to study Torah, it is possible to recite Shema, Barachot, etc., and also Tefillah, as we're discussing here, without going to the Mikveh. And that's mutar, and that's fine, that's okay. And nevertheless, Rambam tells you in the next statement, halacha, well, minhag pashut bisfarad uveshinar. Sfarad is Spain, and Shinar is Bavel. Rambam is using the name that appears in the Torah for Bavel, which is Shinar. It is the minhag, and Rambam stresses minhag, not the halacha. She'en ba'al karim yitpalel ad shehu rohes kol b'saro b'mayim. And the takana that Rambam mentions here is not necessarily a mikveh, tevilah a mikveh, ela washing one's entire body, which means bathing, basically. Doesn't have to be a mikveh, it can be any pool of water or any kind of bathtub or what have you. And nowadays, the more modern invention of a shower, it also includes a shower. The minhag in these places, not in all of the Jewish world, Rambam was aware of the fact that this was not the practice. This was the practice. This minhag took root and took hold in Bavel, more than in Eretz Yisrael, shall we say, in the post-Tanaic or post-Amoraic, post-Talmudic period. She'en ba'al keri mitpalel ad shehu rohetz kol b'saro b'mayim. That a person who is a ba'al keri, any person who has sexual relations, does not recite tefillah only, we're talking about here, without washing all of his body. Mishum hikon likrat Elohecha Yisrael. And one of the Pesukim quoted in this context was the Pasuk in Amos, hikon, prepare yourself, likrat Elohecha, when you approach Hashem. And then Rambam adds some further details. When is this the case? So this is the minhag in Sfarad and in Shinar, in Bavel. And Rambam, of course, came from Sfarad originally. This is true for a bari, a person who's healthy, or hole, or a person who's also not healthy, sheba'al, who deliberately engaged in sexual activity. Aval holesh ra'akari le'onso, but a person who is unwell and had a seminal emission without intending to do so, patur minar rechisa. The minhag does not cover such a case. A person is not required to wash his entire body in order to recite the tefillah. We'en bazeh minhag. This minhag that I'm referring to doesn't apply in this case. And therefore, this also applies in the following cases. The minhag does not apply to these cases. All that is required according to this minhag is that they clean themselves and do natilat yadayim, ruhasim yadehem, u'mitparalim. And then they can daven as usual. And we know that in Bavel, in the time of the Geonim, this was the widespread practice. We know this from various sources. It's mentioned in some sources that there were certain Geonim towards the end of the period of the Geonim, the case that what I'm referring to. It's mentioned in Sefer HaEshkol, perhaps it's on page 10, I don't recall exactly, near the beginning. In Choth, the Baal Keri, at the beginning of Sefer HaEshkol, it mentions a certain Chacham who was elderly, and on Shabbat he would not daven until he could bathe, or maybe go to a mikveh that was heated, which he couldn't do on Shabbat. And in other words, that minhag was a very it was taken seriously, this minhag. But we also know that in other parts of the Jewish world, such as in Europe, this was not the case. That is why you find that Riaz Zaken, Rabbeinu Yitzchak Zaken, Ba'alat Tosafot, says that Min hadin, this is not the case. The Rif mentions this minhag in the name of Rav Hai Gaon, and this is why Rambam mentions it here. But Riaz Zaken points out that this is not according to the din, and it's not according to the sugya, and that's not our minhag. And it was generally not. It was not something that was widely done in much of the Jewish world. And after the Gaonic period, as the large Jewish population in that part of the world, in Bavel, in Paras, began to disperse and move to other countries, and the whole reality of the Geonim and the Yeshivot in Bavel began to unravel, approximately 1,000 years ago, or a bit more. This practice became less and less. This minhag that the Rambam mentions here, that was originally from Shinar, Bavel, and therefore also in Sfarad, because in Sfarad they were very much Semuchim al Shulhan Anshe Bavel. They were very much in line with what was being done in Bavel. Whereas Jews in countries like Italy, Germany, France, and the Balkans, they were in touch with Gonei Bavel, but their halachic practices and Piskei Halacha were not always in line with all of the various opinions of the Geonim. And there you had a different reality, where this was not the case. Bichal, this minhag did not exist. It was only as a result of the spread of Kabbalah and more particularly Hasidut in Eastern Europe, beginning in Ukraine, and then spread later to Poland and parts of Russia, perhaps, not most of Russia really. It was only a result of that the whole concept of going to the Mikveh became once again a common practice in the Jewish world, and certainly in the Ashkenazi world. All right, so that is what we wanted to look at with regards to this particular matter. And now we can return to Hilchot Tefillah.
Rabbi,
Yes.
It's sort of strange that the Rambam mentions neither in Hilchot Tefillah or Hilchot Kriyat Shema that, according to the Takana, people weren't able to be levarech barachot. Is there any reason for that?
Apparently, this is because the view of Rabbi Yehuda mentioned in the Mishneh, where he says mevarech lifnehem ulacharehem, that when it came to barachot, the view of Rabbi Yehuda Bar Ilai became standard practice. I think that's probably the reason. And you can understand why. Again, if you do not adopt that position as the rule of thumb, at least, for most people, that means that many people will be eating and drinking and who knows, going for hours and days and who knows, maybe longer, without reciting any barachot. That's a problematic state of affairs also. So it's always necessary to weigh up all the pros and the cons. That's probably the reason. Very well. Rambam says here, Hilchot Tefillah Birkat Kohanim. Yesh bichlolon shatet mitzvot aseh. In this section, there are two mitzvot aseh according to the Rambam, and other chachamim such as Rabbeinu Sa'adia Gaon, la'avod et Hashem b'tefillah b'chol yom, to pray to Hashem on a daily basis. Rambam adds, la'avod et Hashem. So that's also an important definition. The concept of tefillah is la'avod et Hashem. Chachamim base this idea of this notion of tefillah on the pasuk l'uvdo B'chol levavchem, b'chol nafshechem, that we mentioned in Kriyat Shema. It's called Avodat Hashem, Avodah Shebalev. Avodah in the unqualified sense, in other words, just the word Avodah refers to the Korbanot, refers to Avodat HaMikdash, like the Mishnah Navoth. על שלושה דברים העולם עומד, על התורה ועל העבודה ועל גמילות חסדים. So the Avodah refers there to the Mikdash, to the Avodat HaKorbanot. It's true there are certain Mefarshim who try to explain the word Avodah and that Mishnah in other ways, mainly because the reality of the Mikdash and Korbanot became such a distant memory that it seemed desirable to connect the Mishnah to, as it were, the reality of most Jews who would read this Mishnah, who would learn this Mishnah. So it was explained in various other ways. But the clear pshat, as is mefurash over there in Avot Rabbi Nathan and other places, it's clear that the word Avodah there refers to Avodat HaMikdash. But Avodah Shebalev is also a Chazalic concept. It's also actually a concept from the Tanakh, the concept of Avodat Hashem, etc. So that you already have it in that pasuk over there. But there are many such pasukim that refer to Avodat Hashem, which does not refer to Avodat HaMikdash. According to Rambam and according to Rav Sa'adeh Gaon and others, the mitzvah of Tefillah in general is Minat Torah. The Chovah of Tefillah is Minat Torah. As we know, this is not accepted by all, by any means. The Ramban, the Tosafot, and so it is Mashma from Rashi in a number of places, understand that Tefillah is Midivrei Sofarim. That is not Minat Torah. You can most definitely find Pesukim as an Asmachta, and clearly indicating the importance of Tefillah. And I know no person would deny the importance of Tefillah. How significant it is and how meaningful it is, and therefore the central position that it occupies in the life of a Jew. But the question that we are discussing here is not whether Tefillah is a good thing. We're discussing whether it is a mitzvah min ha-Torah specifically. And according to the Ramban, according to the Tosafot, according to Rashi and others, the answer is no. It is not min ha-Torah. But that doesn't mean it's not important. That doesn't mean that it's not something that we need to be very concerned with and to take very seriously. No one would suggest otherwise. As is true of many mitzvot that we could mention that are not min ha-Torah, and yet they are very very central to what we do and how we conduct ourselves, etc. And it's also obviously true. It's usually the case, in fact almost always the case, that anything which is midivrei soferim technically can be and should be seen as devolving from something in the Torah. That's also always true. So, but according to Rambam, at any rate, there are two mitzvot I say involved in this section, and Tefillah is one of them. And the other one is levarech kohanim et Yisrael b'chol yom. The mitzvah of kohanim in general, any specific kohen, to recite birkat kohanim. And that is something that Rambam discusses at the end of this section of Hilchot. And here we begin now in Perek Rishon. We begin with Hilchot Tefillah. And Rambam says, Mitzvah aseh litpalel b'chol yom. It is a mitzvah min Torah to pray to Hashem every day. Shneimar va'abadtem et Adonai Elohechem. Mpi hashmu'ah amru. There's also a Gidusah, Mpi hashmu'ah amru. Avodah zo hi tefillah. This avodah being referred to in this pasuk, Wa'avadtem et Hashem Elokechem is referring to Tefillah. V'ne'emar u'l'avdo b'chol levavchem. And on this latter pasuk, Chachamim say in the Sifrei, Amaru Chachamim, Ezo hi avodah shebalev, when it speaks about avdo b'chol levavchem, what is it referring to? Zo Tefillah. So the crux of the discussion of the mahloket, whether this is minat Torah, mamash, or midivrei soferim, is whether this is a drasha, what's called a drasha gemura, or an asmachta. And sometimes it's difficult to be certain whether it's one or the other. And that's perhaps how it should be. Because things which are midivrei soferim do indeed flow naturally and inexorably from the Torah. And therefore it's not at all unreasonable. In fact, it would be surprising if it were not so, that many things which we know for a fact are midivrei soferim they occur to us as being the most obvious and necessary things that one could imagine, such as a bracha before eating or drinking something. It's clearly not minat Torah, but it's also clearly something very powerful and something very important, and something which the Chachamim instituted as a something very central, and something that a Jew must take very seriously. Rambam now, as he always does, defines the mitzvah very, very clearly, very precisely. He says, when I say that this is a mitzvah min Torah, what do I mean? He says, En minyana tefillot min Torah. That I do not mean to say the number of tefillot that a Jew is required to recite during a given day is min Torah. That's not true. There is no remez, there is no hint in the Torah at all how many times a day you are required to daven. V'lo mishneh ha-tefillah hazot min ha-Torah. In other words, the form of this tefillah, which refers to the nusach, the actual text that you're required to say. There is no way to learn that directly from the Torah. That's clearly something which is midivrei chachamim, as we know from the statement in Barachot Daf Lamed Gimel. It is these things are a takana of Anshe Knesset HaGadol. In other words, these things go back to the early days of Beit Sheni. So, en minyan ha-tefilot min ha-Torah, v'lo mishneh ha-tefillah hazot min ha-Torah, v'en ha-tefillah zaman kavu' min ha-Torah, nor is there any specific time of day or night that one should daven, or one is required to daven. Ulefichach, and therefore it also follows, Nashim v'avadim hayavim b'tefillah, and this is why Rambam tells you, even though I'm telling you it's a mitzvah asa min ha-Torah, it's not a mitzvah that says zaman garama, because min ha-Torah there is no specific zaman, it doesn't have a particular time frame. It's true the Chachamim later defined the time frames for tefillah, but that's not min ha-Torah. And if it's not min ha-Torah, the mitzvah min ha-Torah is not time specific. And therefore, nashim v'avadim are hayavim b'tefillah. Lefi shehi mitzvah ta'aseh shelo hazaman garama. And it's interesting to note and surprising perhaps to note that in most Jewish communities, for generations, it seems for many centuries, most women did not recite tefillah at all, any kind of tefillah, basically. And you could ask the question, why? I tend to think that one of the main reasons is the lack of knowledge, lack of knowledge with regards to Lashon HaKodesh, the Hebrew language. And even though the halacha is that a person may recite Tefillah and also Kriyat Shema b'chol lashon, in any language that he understands, if he doesn't understand Hebrew. But it's interesting, to note that even sometimes there is a clear halacha, but the Jews have a difficult time with it, in the sense that I don't think it's the Jews didn't want to daven. I don't think it's that women didn't want to daven, for example. But I think it was the case that many people felt that it's pasnisht, as the expression is in Yiddish. In other words, it's not right, it's not proper to daven not in Hebrew. And yes, the outcome therefore is you don't daven at all, perhaps, but it doesn't sit well with the Jewish people that they should daven in a foreign language, even though the halakha specifically addresses this question, which is an interesting point also. But the fact is, the halakha is, and this needs to be stressed, all Jews are required to daven. Again, tefillah, we're talking about tefillah, and tefillah throughout these halachot refers to one thing and one thing only, unless Rambam specifically mentions something else. As he will later on in Perek Zayin, when he talks about Birkot HaShahar, or in other parakim about other kinds, certain other things perhaps. But in general, tefillah refers to one thing, Shmoneh Esrei. Either the full version of Shmoneh Esrei Brachot, or what's called Havinenu, a short version, which is essentially Sheva Brachot, 7 Brachot, 3, one middle bracha, which includes all the others, and then the last 3, or whatever. But Tefillah refers to Shmoneh Esrei. And men and women are required to do so. And one could also, in earlier times, one could make the excuse, perhaps, which was based on the reality that there were many periods of time when many people, particularly women, could not read. And they didn't know these things, they didn't have the opportunity to learn them by heart. Although, you may ask yourself, why not? You could teach these things to young children, as is often the case today. You hear children learning in school, in kindergarten already, they recite every day certain things, they know them by heart within days, within weeks. But the fact is that perhaps we're more successful in some of these things today than in earlier generations. That's also possible. Not everything is always worse today than it was in the past. Sometimes it's the other way around. And it seems to be the case that literacy was also part of this equation. There were also men who didn't. There were situations, there were generations, there were communities where some of the men, perhaps a limited percentage of them, but some of the men couldn't read very well or not at all either. Although, again, that was not the norm. The norm was that boys are hayavim b'tamud Torah, and they were sent to school and they were taught to read, and they could read, and they were required to read. But keep in mind again, even though a man knows how to read Hebrew and can recite the tefillah either by heart or from off the page of a siddur, or the same applies to Birkat HaMazon, for example, which is most definitely Minat Torah, by the way, that doesn't mean necessarily that he will understand what he's saying. Many Jews, for the purpose of this discussion, let's say men, in many communities around the world, shall we say 200 years ago, 300 years ago, perhaps davened 3 times a day, but they didn't really connect linguistically, as it were, in terms of having a natural sense and understanding of the language of the words they were reciting. They didn't really internalize what they were saying. It was just something they parroted. Is that good? No, obviously not. Is that how it should be? Obviously not. But that's better than nothing. It's better than than a Jew not knowing even how to recite it Ba'al Peh. Even if you don't understand it, at least you know there's something called Tefillah and you know how to recite it. And maybe, B'ezrat Hashem, you don't understand it today, maybe next week it will be explained to you and you'll understand more. Although, clearly, as we mentioned, Chazal did not think that that is how Tefillah should be. That is why Chazal, as we will see, the Tefillah, the halacha is that Kriyat Shema and Tefillah are to be recited by a person who does not understand Lashon HaKodesh and therefore doesn't understand what he's saying. He should recite these things in a language he does understand. That's again, that has to do with the Yahid, with the individual, not with the Tzibur. This goes back to what I said before about Am Yisrael not wanting to study, or rather to pray, in a foreign language. With Tzibur, there is no such thing as the Jewish people davening a foreign language. That would be a complete breakdown of our Jewish identity and connection to who we are and where we come from and where we're going. In other words, if the Jews were to begin to, as a community, as a tzibur, if they were to begin to daven in Russian or English or French or whatever language, Yiddish or Ladino, whatever it might be, that would be a disaster. And that was not allowed. That Chazal never endorsed. But for the individual, they clearly stated that the Tefillah should be understood, and Birkat HaMazon should also be understood, for example. And therefore, you don't understand it, then say it in some translation that you do understand. But we'll get to those halachot later. Rambam continues to define this miswah, and he says, so Rambam was defining the miswah. So he said this miswah is minat Torah, but minat Torah, it's not very clearly defined. In other words, as we said, there's no particular number of tefillot or numbers of times a day. There's no particular wording, nusach, that you're supposed to say, what Rambam referred to as a Mishneh HaTefillah, which has to do with like the word Mishneh Torah. In other words, it's a formulation is the best term. I think the best translation. The formulation of the tefillah. There was no specific formulation, minat Torah, and no particular time. Ela, so what is the miswah minat Torah? Ela hayub miswah zo minat Torah, in other words, kachu. She'eh adam mitpalel, umithanen b'chol yom. The idea is, the essential thing is that a person connect to Hashem every day. So how do you connect to Hashem? You praise Hashem, you beseech Hashem, you cry out to Hashem. You understand. This is, of course, based on the understanding that everything about your existence is in the hands of Hashem. This is the most essential thing that a person has to understand. So the chiyuv of this miswah minat Torah is she'eh adam mitpalel o mithanen b'chol yom. Umagid shivho shel HaKodesh Baruch Hu. And to praise Hashem. V'harkach, and also shoel thorachim shehu tzarich lahen. There is a girsa thoracho. And ask Hashem for that which you require. And we all require many things, even for our most basic needs on a daily basis. B'vakasha ubitchina, Rambam stresses, not just to perfunctorily say, I need this, thank you, please send me such and such. To beseech Hashem, b'vakasha ubitchina, to understand that everything is in Hashem's hands. And thus a person who is used to davening to Hashem, this becomes part of his personality, part of his being, that I am in the hands of Hashem. And to thank Hashem, having said these other things that came before, thank Hashem for everything that He gives you. Each according to his ability. What does that mean? Rambam says now, in Halacha Gimel, Im haya ragil, the word ragil means not, it doesn't mean if he's used to something exactly. The word ragil means if he is, for example, the shonoth of the Tanakh, the language of the Tanakh, is shagur al piu. It's something which is, as it were, in his mouth. He's used to it. That's the word. That's where the regil comes from. In other words, he knows the lashon of the Tanakh, and therefore in the Tanakh he also came across many lashonoth, many forms of tefillah, which the Tanakh is full of. You can find this in Sefer Yirmiyahu, you can find it in Sefer Tehillim, you can see it in the Torah. Moshe Rabbeinu recites Tefillah, Avraham Avinu recites Tefillah. So if you're Ragil B'Tanakh, B'Mikra, if the Tanakh is B'ficha of Yilvavecha La'asotho, then it's not going to be difficult for you to find the words to express yourself. Marbe B'Tchina U'Bakasha, and there you will know how to do it. The words will come to you. A person who is far from the Tanakh, who really doesn't know the language of the Tanakh at all, or he's just not very talented, shall we say, in expressing himself linguistically. Im haya aral sefatayim, then what does he do? Medaber kafi yochlo. Then he does the best he can, expresses himself as he's able, and whenever he is able and wishes to do so. So this is still the mitzvah min Torah. So a person who knows how to express himself and how to approach Hashem and how to put into words what is in his heart, whether it's thanks, whether it's bakashot or tehinoth, whether it's asking Hashem for sustenance, for health, for whatever it may be, whether it's just connecting to Hashem. All of these things, a person will know how to express it if he is familiar with the Tanakh, if he's ragil. If he's not so ragil, it'll be more difficult. But he does the best he can. Now the same is true for the number of times that a person might do this during the day. Each will do it according to his ability and according to his spiritual makeup also. There are those who feel the need and the desire to connect to Hashem in this way once a day. And there are others who may be drawn to do this more frequently, more than once a day. In other words, all Jews, and this was understood and known to all, that if you're not in the Mikdash, then when you address Hashem, when you turn to Hashem, you face the Mikdash, which is the physical, geographical, as it were, locus of Hashem on earth. B'chol makom sheyeh, wherever you may be on earth, you face the Mikdash. V'chen haya hadavar tamid, and this is how things were in the Jewish people, amongst the Jewish people. Tamid, Moshe Rabbeinu ad Ezra. And so it was from the beginning, from the time of Moshe Rabbeinu until the time of Ezra Sofer. And then Rambam goes on to discuss, which we will see next time, what happened at the time of Ezra Sofer, what exactly was, how the situation began to require some takana, required the attention of the Chachamim, how to both instill the concept of Tefillah in the Jewish people, and also to facilitate this concept of Tefillah by showing them how it is to be done and giving them some kind of a format, and to formulate the precise way of going about it. So we shall stop here for today. B'ezrat Hashem, Hayu Beruchim, Hizku v'yamas levavchem, Kol hameyahalim l'Adonai. Be strong, be strong in heart and mind and spirit. All those who yearn for Hashem. We live in very interesting and trying times. No one knows what the coming hours and days and weeks bring, but it seems we can be sure of one thing, that it won't be boring. Shalom, kol tov lachem. Shalom v'nisachon.